"This isn't your house anymore." That's what my mother's new husband said before his fist cracked across my face. The same porch where my father once taught me how to measure wood now smelled of cheap beer and betrayal. My mother stood behind him, frozen her hand gripping the door frame like it could keep her from choosing sides. 11 years away, and somehow I was the intruder in my own home. I didn't fight back. I just looked at him calm and steady while his rage filled the silence. Because what he didn't know was that I already owned everything behind that door. What would you do, walk away in silence, or take back what your father built with his own hands? When I left Maine 11 years ago, I told myself I'd never come back. I packed my life into 2 suitcases, caught the last train out of Portland, and promised my reflection in the train window that I was done chasing ghosts. Back then, I was 23, newly licensed as an architect, and desperate to prove that I could build something of my own. Chicago gave me that chance. Skyscrapers, deadlines, clients who saw my blueprints as gospel. For a while, success drowned out the sound of the sea I grew up beside. But no amount of city lights can outshine guilt. My father, Michael Morgan, had been a craftsman, boat builder, dreamer, and the kind of man who measured twice, cut once, and loved forever. His workshop stood at the edge of the water where salt air kissed pine. He died before seeing it expand, before seeing the plans we drew together come to life. And when he was gone, my mother, Evelyn, fell apart in slow motion. She sold little pieces of him first, the tools, then the stories. When she met Ethan, the so-called investor who offered to modernize the business, I didn't fight it. I was young, angry, tired of being the responsible one. I thought leaving would protect me. I was wrong. In Chicago, I still sent money every year. Property taxes, maintenance bills, small payments to keep the workshop from foreclosure. I told myself I was doing enough, that love could be wired through a bank transfer. I didn't know Ethan was already sinking his claws deeper, convincing my mother that my distance meant indifference. By the time her email landed in my inbox, I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 3 years. The subject line was simple workshop, the message short surgical. She wrote that they had decided to sell. It's time to move on, she said, as if grief had an expiration date. She wanted me to sign away my share to make things easy, and the offer $10,000 for the entire legacy of a man who spent 30 years carving perfection out of wood. I reread the message twice, then a third time. My chest didn't tighten. It hollowed. I wasn't angry, yet, just cold. Ethan's fingerprints were all over it. Quick sale, quick payout, no conversation. The same man who hadn't even known my father when the foundation was poured was now claiming ownership over every nail, every beam. I closed the email, stared at the blank reflection on my laptop screen, and finally whispered, no. Not to them, but to myself. Because the workshop wasn't just property, it was proof that craft meant more than profit. And if they wanted to erase my father's name, they'd have to go through mine first. The next morning, the plane dipped through gray clouds and the coast appeared ragged cold and heartbreakingly familiar. Maine looked exactly like it always had, stubborn and quiet. The taxi driver barely spoke, just hummed along to an old country station, while I watched the pine trees flick past the window. Every mile closer to the house felt heavier, like I was driving back into a version of myself I thought I'd outgrown. When we turned onto the gravel road leading to my family's property, my stomach tightened. The house stood where it always had, but the details were wrong. My father's wooden sign that once read, Morgan Workshop, handcrafted boats. Since 1978 was gone, replaced by a cheap printed banner, Cole Marine Design. The shutters were peeling, the porch lights flickered, and the yard looked neglected as if no one there cared about roots anymore. I stepped out, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. My suitcase wheels scraped over the gravel as I climbed the steps. For a second, I hesitated, my hand inches from the doorknob. Then it opened. My mother stood there. Evelyn Morgan, once graceful and warm, looked smaller now. Her hair had grayed her smile too practiced. Amanda, she said, her voice unsure, like she wasn't certain I was real. Before I could answer, a shadow filled the doorway behind her. Ethan. Mid-30s, still trying to dress like he belonged in a boardroom, not a boatyard. The smell of beer hit me before his words did. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said, smirking. "The runaway daughter. I came to talk about the workshop," I said evenly. He laughed a short, ugly sound. "The workshop? You mean my business?" He stepped past my mother, chest puffed, blocking the door. "This isn't your house anymore." For a moment, everything went still. The sound of the sea, the crunch of gravel under his boots, even the air itself. My mother flinched at his words but said nothing. Then came the hit. His fist caught my cheek, sharp and fast like punctuation. I didn't fall. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, the metallic taste of blood on my tongue, staring at him while the porch light buzzed overhead. Evelyn gasped, "Ethan, stop." But she didn't reach for me. She reached for him. That was what broke something inside me, not the punch, but the silence that followed it. I adjusted my coat, straightened my back, and looked him dead in the eye. "You're right," I said softly. "It's not my house." I turned toward the driveway, "But it's not yours either." I walked away without another word. Behind me, I could hear him muttering, calling me ungrateful, crazy, useless. I didn't care. The anger I expected never came. Only clarity did, cold and sharp as the winter air. By the time I reached the road, I already knew what I needed to do next. I pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and found the name I hadn't called in years, Daniel Chen. The motel room smelled faintly of salt and detergent. A single lamp hummed beside the bed as I sat on the edge holding a cold compress against my cheek. The bruise hadn't fully surfaced yet, but the ache beneath it was steady, like a reminder not to forget what I came here for. I set the ice pack down, reached for my laptop, and opened the folder I'd guarded for years. Inside were the receipts, tax bills, and transfer records, every payment I'd quietly made to keep the workshop alive. My father's blueprints, his last letter, and at the very bottom, folded inside a sleeve of plastic, the original deed papers signed in his steady hand. The artisan clause was right where I had written it. When I was 19, the property shall be used exclusively for handcrafted marine craft. Any attempt to mass produce or sell prefabricated vessels will result in immediate breach of ownership. Ethan had no idea that clause even existed. He'd stepped into my father's life work like it was a pawn shop and thought charm could cover theft. When Daniel Chen answered, his voice was gravelly older but still calm, the same man who had guided my father through every contract. "Amanda," he said quietly, "I was wondering when you'd call." "They're selling it," I told him. "He hit me today. Said it wasn't my house anymore." There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "Do you still have the original deed?" "Yes," I said. "Every page." "Then we start there." He promised to file an emergency injunction first thing in the morning. "Ethan's type never checks the fine print," he said. "If that clause holds, we freeze everything, assets, accounts, sales. He won't be able to touch a nail without court approval." After the call, I stayed still, listening to the ocean outside. For the first time, the sound didn't feel peaceful. It sounded like a warning. I opened the drawer beside me and found an old notepad. On the first page, I wrote down everything Ethan had done, the fake sale, the forged documents, the blow to my face, my mother's silence. It wasn't a diary entry. It was evidence. Around 2 a.m., I drove down to the waterfront. The workshop lights were still on. Through the dusty windows, I saw Ethan pacing, phone pressed to his ear, the banner, Cole Marine Design, hanging behind him. He was already trying to unload my father's legacy to someone else. I gripped the steering wheel and whispered, "Go ahead. Sell it. I dare you." Then I drove back to the motel, slipped the deed papers under my pillow, and finally let my body relax. I wasn't just my father's daughter anymore. I was his final defense. By sunrise, the storm would begin, only this time I'd be the one holding the hammer. The next morning broke cold and white, the kind of morning that bit straight through your coat. I stood outside the courthouse with Daniel Chen, my father's oldest friend, his silver hair stirring in the wind. He carried a folder thick enough to crush a man's confidence, and I carried my father's leather notebook, the one that still smelled faintly of sawdust. "Ready?" Daniel asked. "I've been ready for 11 years, I said. By the time we drove to the workshop, a local sheriff's cruiser followed behind us. The injunction had been signed an hour earlier. Ethan just didn't know it yet. The sky hung low, the color of pewter, when we pulled up to the property. The yard was a mess, discarded lumber, empty beer cans, the once bright Morgan Workshop sign lying face down in the dirt. Ethan's truck was parked crooked beside the bay doors. Through the open frame, I could hear music blasting over the whir of machines. We stepped inside. The smell hit me, first chemical resin oil, not a trace of cedar or varnish. Ethan stood by the main bench, beer in hand, watching two men load fiberglass hulls onto a trailer. When he saw me, his smirk spread slow, lazy like a cat that thought it had cornered a bird. "Well, look who brought a lawyer," he said, raising his can. "You sure you're in the right place? Thought you quit this family years ago." "I didn't quit," I said. "I invested." Daniel's calm voice cut in. "Mr. Cole, as of this morning, the court has issued a temporary injunction. You are required to cease all sales transfers and production until ownership is clarified." Ethan's smile faltered just for a heartbeat before he laughed. "You've got to be kidding me. Evelyn owns this place now. She signed everything over." Daniel opened the folder. Actually, she didn't. "You forged her signature on the second loan document, and the bank flagged it. Then you tried to fake Amanda's. That's forgery and wire fraud." Ethan blinked, eyes narrowing. "You think you can prove that I don't have to think," I said, stepping forward. "I can." I pulled a copy of the original deed from my bag and laid it on the workbench between us. My father's signature gleamed faintly beneath the plastic sleeve. "This clause," I said, tapping the page, "states that the workshop can only be used for handcrafted marine craft, not fiberglass kits from overseas, not mass-produced garbage with my father's name stamped on it. Every boat you've sold under Morgan violates that clause. Every sale is fraud." He stared at the paper like it might bite him. "You wouldn't dare take this to court." "I already did." His face drained. For the first time, Ethan looked small. Then, like cornered men always do, he turned angry. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You left. You don't belong here." I took a slow breath. "You're right. I left. But that doesn't make me blind." I looked around the room, the cheap tools, the wrecked workbenches, the gray paint smeared over the oak beams my father and I had sanded together. "You didn't just steal from me, Ethan. You erased him." He lunged forward, but the sheriff moved faster, stepping between us. "Mr. Cole, I'd stay right there if I were you." "Get out of my way," Ethan snarled. "Not my call," the sheriff said, nodding toward Daniel, who handed him a second folder. "Court order. We're freezing all assets until the investigation's complete." Ethan turned to my mother, who had appeared in the doorway, her robe half-tied, face pale. "Evelyn, tell her she has no right to do this." My mother's hands trembled. "Ethan, please, stop." "Stop," he barked. "They're stealing everything. The deals, the equipment." She cut him off, voice cracking. "You stole first." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. For the first time, she looked at me not as an intruder, but as the last person still standing in her corner. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't look away. Ethan shoved a box off the table, papers scattering like snow. "You think you can ruin me?" Daniel spoke quietly. "You already did that yourself." The sheriff took a slow step forward. "Ethan Cole, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Put the can down." For a second, I thought he might swing. His eyes burned, jaw clenched. But when the sheriff reached for his cuffs, Ethan's shoulders sagged. "You'll regret this," he hissed at me as the metal snapped around his wrists. "I already did," I said, "for 11 years. They walked him past me toward the door. The trailer outside still carried the fiberglass hulls he'd tried to sell. As the engine started, I called out, "Make sure those are impounded. They're evidence." Ethan twisted in the back seat, face pressed against the window, shouting words I couldn't hear over the hum of the cruiser. When the car disappeared down the road, the silence that replaced it was almost too loud. My mother leaned against the doorway, shaking. I didn't know she whispered. "He said it was just business, that he'd make your father proud." I stared at her for a long moment. Dad didn't build this place for business. He built it for integrity. She nodded slowly, her face crumpling. "I was lonely, Amanda." "I know," I said softly, "but loneliness isn't an excuse to destroy someone's legacy." Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Amanda, the injunction is secure. We'll start the audit tomorrow." I nodded, then walked to the center of the workshop. The air was thick with dust and paint fumes, but beneath it lingered something faint, the ghost of cedar and salt. I knelt, touched the floorboards, and let my palm rest on the wood. My father's initials were still carved near the corner, barely visible beneath the grime. I closed my eyes and whispered, "We did it, Dad." Behind me, my mother's sobs turned into quiet breaths. Daniel packed the papers, the sheriff's radio crackled somewhere outside. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I stood. "We'll restore everything I said. No banners, no fake brand names, just Morgan." My mother wiped her eyes. "You really think you can fix it?" I looked around the ruined space, the stripped walls, the missing tools, the empty racks where masterpieces once stood. "I don't need to fix it," I said. "I just need to rebuild it." When the last light of the day slid across the floor, I caught my reflection in one of the windows. For the first time, I didn't look like the runaway daughter or the outsider. I looked like someone coming home. As Daniel and the sheriff left, I stayed behind. The workshop creaked in the wind, old and wounded, but still standing. I walked to the table, picked up my father's compass, the only tool Ethan hadn't touched, and set it in the center. He thought the workshop was a business. He thought the house was his. He thought the fight was over. He was wrong about all three. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, catching the last light like silver dust. I leaned against the doorway, the same one where Ethan had struck me, and exhaled. For the first time in over a decade, the air felt clean. The war was over, and the legacy was mine to protect. Ethan's trial didn't take long. The evidence Daniel gathered, bank transfers, forged contracts, and the sales under my father's name, was airtight. He pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence. 7 years in state prison. When the verdict was read, my mother sat in the back of the courtroom, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at me when it ended, but she whispered, "I'm sorry," and for once I believed her. I stayed in Maine for weeks after the sentencing. Each morning I unlocked the workshop, rolled up my sleeves, and began the slow process of reclaiming what was ours. The gray paint came off the oak beams, one layer at a time. I scrubbed the floors, replaced the broken windows, and restored the sign that had once hung proudly by the Road Morgan workshop. Handcrafted boats since 1978. One afternoon, while sweeping under the main bench, my broom caught on something solid. I knelt down, pulled back a loose plank, and found a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were my father's chisels, his compass, and a folded note edges yellowed. "For when you come home." I sat on the dusty floor, holding the tools like relics. The ache in my chest wasn't grief anymore, it was peace. My father's hands had built the legacy, but mine had brought it back to life. The day I rehung my father's sign, the air was sharp with salt and sawdust. The workshop stood proud again. No banners, no noise, just wood and silence. I ran my hand across the letters Morgan Workshop. Handcrafted boats since 1978. For years, I thought leaving meant abandoning him, but now I understand it was preparation. I had to leave to become strong enough to come back. Ethan's arrest wasn't victory. Rebuilding was. Justice wasn't about punishment, it was about restoration, about refusing to let greed rewrite love. My father's name didn't survive because of courts or lawyers. It survived because I refused to surrender what he built. Sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones who sell us out. But even then, you still have the power to reclaim what's rightfully yours. If you've ever been betrayed by your own family, tell me, what did you do next? Did you walk away or fight back? Comment below. I read every story. And when this video ends, don't stop here. Watch the next stories about family betrayal, silent revenge, and redemption after loss. You might find a piece of your own story waiting there.